Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Carol Warshaw, the Director of the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And today's webinar is on recovery-oriented systems of care in honor of Recovery Month. It will be presented by Gabriela Zapata Alma, the Director of Policy and Practice for Domestic Violence and Substance Use at the National Center. Before we get started, I would like to go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using This Webinar System tab in the center of your screen. You can switch to the screen from the slides by clicking the down arrow next to Using This Webinar. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. Third from the bottom is the chat feature. You may have to click on the chat cloud icon at the bottom center of your screen to open your chat box. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have questions regarding the training content. You may contact Carla Alegria, also with the center, if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you'd like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you'd like to respond to a question from the trainer or to contact center staff at any time during the session. You should click on Carla Alegria to privately contact her if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, type in the where you're calling from, and then press enter. Perfect. Thank you all very much. While people can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are a lot of times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there's a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. Time permitting, I'll be moderating the Q&A towards the end via the chat box. And at the very end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a brief survey. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call back in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Carla, you may call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any issues. That phone number, which I'll post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to Gabriela.
Thanks so much, Carol. So our topics for today, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. In honor of Recovery Month, we'll be talking about recovery-oriented systems of care. And so we'll go over some of the principles of recovery-oriented systems of care, how this represents something new and innovative from treatment as usual. And then we'll have a chance to reflect on how DVSA advocacy services can support survivors' recovery capital. We'll talk a little more about that concept, recovery capital. And then we will end the webinar with talking about local recovery community organizations and what are some ways that you can connect with your local recovery community organization. But first, taking a moment to reflect on our work and how our work is really informed by and grounded in a survivor-defined approach, physical and emotional safety, hope and resilience, relationship and connection, and how all of that is nestled within a trauma-informed approach, rights and social justice, a cultural, historical, and community context, and domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy. So some context for our work. So why recovery-oriented systems of care? So shorthand ROSC. ROSC came about with the acknowledgement that the different issues and different concerns that are raised by substance use were being treated with an acute care model and really only a crisis response. And that in order to build a life of recovery and have a much more kind of long-term stability, that we needed to move away from this acute care or crisis kind of care and move into a more long-term approach and a more community-based approach. And so recovery-oriented systems of care, while treatment can certainly be an important ally within recovery-oriented systems of care, it's so much more than just treatment. So approaches to substance use care need to be accessible and engaging in order to be effective. So they must be informed and shaped by the needs of the individual and families seeking recovery, including being responsive to gender and culture. And that whenever possible, substance use support must be available and offered in a person's natural environment, including their home and within their community. So this represents a real departure from the idea that you need to go somewhere else in order to work on recovery, but that recovery is something that happens here and now. I like to say there is no place that is safe from recovery. Recovery happens everywhere. And so what does it mean to be recovery-oriented? In its simplest form, it means that we're focused on recovery and all the things that help people recover rather than being focused on addiction. And this is something that I think really aligns well with our framework and our services within advocacy services, because we are strengths-based and we do look at what is going right for the person and how can we build on that rather than always being problem-focused. Recovery orientation also means being committed to solution-making and comprehensive recovery support. And we'll get a little more into what that means. So building on the strengths and resilience of individuals, families, and communities. Very importantly, anti-stigma. So recognizing the stigma that is often associated with substance use concerns, particularly for women and for people who are already experiencing violence and other kinds of barriers. There's stigma can really overlap and become very, very difficult to navigate. And so at the core of being recovery-oriented means really approaching substance use in a matter-of-fact way, and that in a non-judgmental way, and really fighting the stigma that is associated with substance use or histories of substance use. And recovery-oriented systems of care are guided by a set of principles and values, and we'll talk a little more about that. So why might ROSC be important for survivors? Well, many survivors experience substance use concerns, including substance use coercion, while also experiencing many barriers to accessible, safe, and effective treatment. Barriers to treatment can come from the treatment system itself. It can come from a lack of access to resources, such as transportation and childcare, and barriers can also be set up by abusers. What we found is that for people who do seek some kind of treatment, over 60% reported that their partner or ex-partner attempted to interfere with their seeking out of treatment. So people who've not been well served by traditional treatment models are more likely to be better served within ROSC, especially because ROSC has an attention to gender, culture, family needs, as well as a commitment to community-based support, anti-stigma, and providing services in ways that are defined and driven by the person seeking recovery. For many of us, that may sound very refreshing because many times when people connect with some traditional forms of treatment, what they have found is that it can be very prescriptive and that it can seek to be very, in some ways, controlling, and that's actually can be re-traumatizing for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And that something that is, I would say, even more important is that our programs can practice recovery-oriented approaches and provide recovery-oriented support. Because recovery-oriented systems of care are much more than just what is provided through a formal treatment provider, it actually is about a whole recovery-oriented community, and we as providers are part of that community. So what is included in recovery support services, which make up a big part of recovery-oriented systems of care? So there's vocational support, resource advocacy, service coordination and linkage, outreach, help with relapse prevention for those who are abstinent from using substances, assistance with housing and different kinds of housing services, child care, support around transportation, family, parent, child development support, peer-to-peer services so that people with lived experience who are now long-term recovery are providing services including mentoring and coaching, mutual aid groups, and we'll talk a little more about that, but these are community-based recovery support groups where people who share experiences of substance use concerns support one another, and then life skills support, and then education around substance use. These services are most often offered by peers, so people in long-term recovery or the family members of people in long-term or with lived experience of substance use, but can also be provided by volunteers as well as paid staff, or can be linked to in the community. And something I want to mention is that substance use education does not equal scare tactics. And so we know that scare tactics don't work when it comes to substance use education. It kind of makes people shut down, and it makes them question the information that we're providing, and that it's important to remain survivor-defined, trauma-informed, and that scare tactics are shaming and really do shut down the conversation. And so the topics around substance use education would need to be driven by the survivor's self-defined needs and preferences and what questions they have. I'd love for folks to enter in the chat box. What are some of these services that your program already provides? So which of these services you see on this slide are already being provided by your advocates from within your organization? A lot of these, absolutely, resource advocacy, all the services listed, that's great. Most of these services, the majority. So we can see how there's a lot of the pieces around recovery support services that we already offer and we already do. And so really looking at how can we build on what we're already doing and provide a little more specialized support for those who may be experiencing some concerns about their substance use. And that's so much of what we already do goes so far in supporting people in their recovery needs. So what is recovery? When we talk about being recovery-oriented, that's pretty different than being focused on addiction. And so what can be helpful is even as a team or with the survivor, have a sense of what does that future look like for them? How do they define recovery? I remember one person I was working with who he shared with me, if recovery was just about giving up drugs, I'd have no reason to do it, right? And so what are the things that make recovery even appealing or worth it to somebody? And that it's so much more than just not doing something. Something I want to mention here too is that the word recovery may not resonate with everyone and may even be off-putting to some people, especially if a person experiences the term recovery as labeling them of having a substance use disorder or somehow needing to be fixed. right? And we know that people don't need to be fixed. People aren't broken. Nobody needs to be fixed. And so here, it's so important to find out how people describe their own experience and their goals. Some people just talk about their experience as one of seeking healing. Some people describe it as getting healthy. Other people may talk about recovery in the terms of finding balance in their life. So there are a lot of ways that people can conceptualize their goals, and the most important thing is to be able to have those conversations where people can reflect on this and really define this for themselves. So for this webinar, we'll stick with the term recovery as a general placeholder, keeping in mind that we will be most effective when avoiding labels and listening for how people experience and describe their own situation and their own goals. So a working definition for recovery, and this is a working definition that comes from SANSA, a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. And so here, I tend to really focus on the living a self-directed life. That most of the time when people experience and identify concerns related to their substance use, it's because it's getting in the way of their life goals and their needs. And so where we can be most helpful is helping folks and supporting them in being able to reach their goals and in being able to increase their decision-making power. And so here, again, our focus is not on getting someone to stop doing something, right? It's not about stopping the use of drugs. It's about how can we help them and support them in reaching their goals and living a self-directed life. And so the guiding principles of recovery-oriented systems of care, I want to invite everyone as we go through these principles to track which of these principles align with the core values of your advocacy, and keep track which ones might be new or might represent a departure from the core values of your advocacy. And towards the end of the principles, I'm going to ask folks to write in the chat box the ones that they felt like most aligned with their advocacy, and then if there were any that felt like an outlier. So recognizing many pathways to recovery, that there are a lot of ways that people experience recovery. There's a lot of things that lead to recovery. I'm going to invite folks to go ahead and put in the chat box, what are some of the paths to recovery that they've heard about, that they've experienced, that they've seen others pursue? And within recovery-oriented systems of care, we often think about recovery journeys being so unique that there can be a lot of common themes. There might be some different trails on that hike that we share during different points in our lives, but that just as we each have unique fingerprints, that our experiences of recovery and our paths of recovery are also unique. So here we have absolutely SMART recovery, refuge recovery, 12 steps, celebrate recovery, self-inquiry, self-knowledge, yoga, religion, harm reduction, mindfulness. Thanks so much, everyone. So there are so many pathways to recovery. So we're going to go over some of the more common ones, but this is not an exhaustive list, and I want folks to really be open and curious because folks, there are so many ways that people find their path towards recovery and really carve out their path towards recovery. And so this by no means is a full list. So we'll go through these. So what is called natural recovery, also known as aging out or the maturation phenomenon. And so this is the little known fact that a large portion of individuals will recover from problematic or risky substance use without ever encountering a treatment professional or a self-help program. And that the majority of folks who experience risky use especially around those kind of adolescence and early adulthood years, just spontaneously resolve to moderate or minimal use as they age. And so a lot of times these are folks that would never identify as being in recovery. These are folks that just may have met criteria at some point for a substance use disorder or risky use or heavy use and just kind of grew out of it. And so this is something to keep in mind. Sometimes when we meet someone who is, having some concerns around their substance use, we can have a knee-jerk reaction of, well, we have to get this personal treatment, right? And that there's actually a lot of options, that treatment can be very important and very needed for some people, and there should absolutely be access to treatment. And at the same time, there are a lot of things that people can do in order to move towards their goals that aren't necessarily just formal treatment. There's medication-assisted recovery, and so the goals of medication-assisted recovery are to decrease the intensity of the withdrawal, to prevent relapse by addressing cravings, and folks may not know that women actually neurologically tend to experience more intense cravings, which can then increase the relapse potential, and that this kind of neurobiology around cravings can be leveraged by abusers who then can activate that craving response and activate relapse as a way of entrapping someone in an abusive relationship. And then medications, of course, for overdose reversal, including naloxone for opioid overdose reversal. And the FDA-approved medications are mostly for opioids, alcohol, and tobacco. There are some, different studies going on for stimulants, for medications to help with stimulant use disorder, but as of now, that's not very available. Let's see. Then another path is faith-based. So faith-based approaches include an array of experiences, from the uniquely personal and inner experience of faith as a source of healing to recovery support found in faith communities, including support from faith leaders. This also includes faith-based mutual aid resources and can even include formal treatment that includes a religious or spiritual component. And so what's so important here is to really highlight how unique every person's recovery path is and how faith may be restorative for some while also being a source of trauma for others. And so it's important to never assume or force a faith-based resource. At the same time, we don't want to ignore or turn away when a survivor talks to us about the role of faith in their pain and in their healing. And so actually later this year and next year, we'll be putting out some resources for how to support survivors as they bring up different matters of faith in their healing from trauma. And there can certainly be some overlap here with culturally specific practices, especially when we understand faith as another dimension of culture and social identity. And so cultural healing practices, culturally specific approaches are often rooted in tradition. And so here we can ask a person what cultural traditions or resources may be important in their healing and see how it would be comfortable for them and supportive for them to incorporate some of these. And then I've also included the link for culturally specific DVRN resource centers. And something I want to note here is that it's when someone is of a minority culture or marginalized culture and is in a program that is not culturally specific, sometimes we can feel like this is something that won't be understood, and we're unlikely sometimes to raise it unless it's very clearly asked about and there's respect and attention and care given for the information that we provide about our culture. And so This is where I've had many experiences asking survivors this question and having people feel comfortable and safe enough to tell me about their culture, especially when it's a culture that I may not have much knowledge of. And then really holding and respecting that information and incorporating that in their services in ways that they deem to be helpful. Family-based. So family-based path includes family support and can also include formal treatment approaches such as family-based treatment. Family-based treatment includes many pieces, including home-based services that focus on families with small children and integrate child well-being, infant mental health, parent-child attachment, and substance use treatment, including access to psychiatry and medication-assisted recovery. There's also community reinforcement and family training approach and therapy approaches that have been found effective, especially for adolescent substance use concerns. And then formal treatment. So looking at the continuum of care, that treatment isn't just inpatient detox, that there actually can be outpatient-based detox. When I was a formal treatment provider, we actually only did intensive outpatient and outpatient and worked with folks who weren't able to come in through telemedicine and teletherapy. And that really going beyond that, people need to do some kind of inpatient stay before they can return to their community. Now, that said, inpatient is still important for some people at some point, and it is very important to find inpatient providers where people can bring their children with them when they do have children in their care. Moderation. So we most typically talk about moderating the volume or the frequency of how much we consume in substance of a substance. We usually apply this to alcohol. And there is a strong evidence base for moderation of alcohol use. Many times people will begin with a period of abstinence before engaging in a moderated form of use, but that's not necessarily required. This approach usually involves tracking your own use and using some different self-management strategies. And then substance use management. Substance use management is not about necessarily stopping the use of drugs or trying to convince someone to stop using drugs. What it is increasing responsible decision-making through developing a plan around substance use that prioritizes safe housing, access to income, health, and social and family needs. And so here we often talk about that everyone has a plan around their substance use, even if that plan is something they haven't really thought about. Sometimes we call that the natural plan. And so sometimes I said to folks, what would it feel like, what would it look like to actually plan out your use so that you could still use your money for what you need, you could still maintain your housing, you could still take care of your family and maintain your relationships, right? And that for some folks who aren't able or ready or willing to engage in abstinence goal, substance use management becomes very important for them and for the health of their family. So there are technology-based approaches, including online programs as well as apps for smart devices. There are apps around coping skills, mindfulness, breathing, helping with sleep, as well as managing cravings, setting goals, tracking substance use, tracking sober days, connecting with sober supports, locating mutual aid groups. And of course, we need to be thoughtful and careful with things such as our location being tracked through a smart device because of needing to stay safe, as safe as possible, and the different risks posed by potential stalking. We also need to be careful that phones, for some, can present cues for craving to use as well. So being able to have open conversations around what will be helpful around a technology base, what will be supportive, as well as what are some things that we need to safety plan around. I know that there are some different apps out there like Calm and Breathe, and there's just so many different apps. I encourage everyone to check them out and kind of play around with them. And there's even an app that is now FDA approved as a prescription digital therapeutic to be used in addition to outpatient treatment. And then fitness-based. So I have met many folks throughout my life who actually found that physical activity and the goal around, quote, getting healthy was what led them to a life of recovery. And so physical activity can contribute to motivation for recovery as well as provide structured activity and community. And I wanted to point out a free, sober, active community that is intentionally anti-stigma called the Phoenix. And here I have a map that shows their current locations. And body work can overlap with fitness as well as culturally specific traditions. What's interesting about body work is that this is often found to be an important component of processing trauma as well, and really attending to how we store trauma in our bodies, and can overlap very nicely with mind-body kinds of inner practices that help us to self-soothe and self-regulate. And so one thing in particular, this picture here I want to point out is actually it's ear seeds. And some folks I imagine who are tuning in may have heard of or even used ear seeds in the past. But there is some scientific evidence showing that ear acupuncture can help with sleep, can help with eating, and can help with managing cravings, as well as with feelings of feeling sad or slowed down or depressed. And so a lot of treatment programs have actually started adding ear seeds, because ear seeds, you don't need an acupuncture license because it doesn't actually puncture the skin. And so people who don't like needles, also ear seeds are more accessible. And they're put on with like a little bit of surgical tape over certain pressure points in the ear. You shower with them, you sleep with them, they stay on for a couple weeks, they fall off naturally, and they're really, really affordable. And so you can actually buy them online, learn how to do them just really by watching videos online, and then help people learn how to put them on each other. And it can be something that you offer for really low cost that can add a more holistic component that is based in scientific evidence. And then quantum. So while recovery is often a long-term process or a journey, many people describe it as, some people experience recovery as happening all of a sudden, kind of cataclysmic. And so quantum recovery is often preceded by what we call like an aha moment or a spiritual experience. People often describe this experience as like a lightning strike that resets your perspective and your experience of life. Now, while we know that quantum recovery can happen, what we don't know is what brings it about. What makes quantum, how do we trigger quantum recovery? And so this is something that we can't necessarily support people in accessing, but is something that people can experience. And then mutual aid. So mutual aid is a form of peer-based support. And what defines mutual aid is that it's a recovery-oriented process where peers support one another by sharing experiences, community, coping strategies, and hope, while also supporting each other to overcome experiences of chaotic substance use, shame, and isolation. Mutual aid groups are not the same as formal treatment or professionally provided services. And so mutual aid is generally supported by research findings there's just a research because mutual aid is all about wanting to be a part of a group, wanting to go to that group. And so we can't say that we can't do really rigorous forms of research because it's really based on someone's choice and self-selection. That said, what we do seem to know about it is that people who feel connected to the group, so people who connect socially within the group, tend to have more positive outcomes and tend to continue going to the group. That seems pretty clear, right? Now, us, advocates, peer support specialists, recovery coaches, and other service providers, we can help by, if people are interested in mutual aid, we can provide information about mutual aid. We can also support safe access. So here are a bunch of different mutual aid resources. A lot of them are available across our country. And then 12-step is absolutely the most available. 12-step is available and accessible in almost every community. And it's the one that people tend to be more familiar with, they've heard of before. Now, some people go through 12-step and have, no problem with it, and other people who have experienced trauma and victimization can find it potentially re-traumatizing or really challenging. And so I wanted to offer up this resource by Stephanie Covington, A Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps, which is a gender-responsive and trauma-informed adaptation of 12 steps. And so this can be something that a program, if you decide to have some kind of 12-step group available within your services, you may decide to check out this resource and have a 12-step group that is based on this resource. And also for folks that are engaging in medication-assisted treatment, while 12-step-based programs are absolutely neutral on the use of medications to assist in treatment, there's a lot of stigma around medications. And so sometimes when people who use medications such as methadone or buprenorphine or naltrexone go to a 12-step meeting, they can sometimes be met with messages that somehow their sobriety is not real or not valid because they're taking medications. Now, that is not something that 12-step endorses, but people can still get those messages. And so sometimes it can be important to connect people to a group that is going to be, that we know is going to be affirming of medications. And then I also wanted to offer this resource, Real Tools, Responding to Multi-Abuse Trauma by Debbie Edmond and, of course, Patty Bland, who is here at our center and who we love and miss dearly. And here in one section, I would say on page 228, there is a whole piece around adapting the 12 steps for survivors of domestic violence and or sexual assault. So I wanted to offer that resource. And then sometimes people who want to access 12-step really have trouble with the concept of feeling that it is too religious or too spiritual. And so I wanted to offer some resources for secular and agnostic and atheist and humanist-based 12-step, as well as secular mutual aid traditions. So there are many traditions that are not necessarily focused on any kind of sense of religion or spirituality. And all of these have both in-person meetings as well as online. And so for folks who may pose a safety risk, or they may not have access, or may just simply not want to go to an in-person meeting, they can still access a lot of support online. And that's where we can help folks through helping them to access technology, helping them to access technology safely, especially if they're experiencing substance use coercion and there may be someone who is abusive and trying to limit their access to recovery support. And for more resources on mutual aid, I highly recommend this directory, the Faces and Voices of Recovery. So with so many different pathways, how can we tell what might be helpful for somebody? Well, I'm going to make it simple. We ask people, we talk with them, we ask what's been helpful in the past. Sometimes people, sometimes their experience has been starting to use from a very early age in ways that feel chaotic or ways that feel really get in the way of their goals. And so we can ask them when have been times that they have felt that their use has been more controlled or more easier to manage. We can share information with folks with their permission and just get them to weigh in and let us know what they think would be helpful. While, of course, really looking at and inviting that reflection around how our culture and social identities inform and shape our recovery. And so research has shown that most people will engage at least 2 different pathways of recovery, often 3 or more. And that which pathways of recovery they find more relevant, more useful, more resonant with their experience is largely shaped by culture and social context. So now moving forward with continuing the principles of recovery-oriented systems of care, it involves a personal recognition for a need to change, and that people are able to come to these personal insights when they feel safe, when they can talk about their experiences and their substance use and feel that it's okay to be vulnerable in those ways, and that they're not going to lose access to services and resources they need in order to stay safe and to survive, and that they're not going to be judged or shamed. And so if I think I'm going to get kicked out or judged or shamed around my experience of substance use, then what's going to happen is that I'm going to work really hard to defend and protect my substance use. I'm not going to talk about it, and I'm really not going to have the space I need to reflect on it and come to a place of being able to recognize for myself and share with someone else that there are things about my substance use that aren't working for me, and there are things that I'd like to change. So how do we connect, right? First, building that safe environment, that safe relationship to discuss substance use. But how do we connect with motivation, right? Well, we can reflect on what matters most to me. What are my core values? What are my most pressing goals? How can I safely connect to those pieces? And so when we help people link their goals within their personal values, how can we support someone to root their goals within their core values while remaining survivor-defined and led? And so survivors always have choice within our services. Our services only work because we are different in that we are guided and led by survivors' choices, and we are a space where survivors can hear their own voice rather than being persuaded or convinced or told, right? And so we seek to come alongside to offer resources and options. For some survivors, they might just let us know that it's not the right time or place for them to feel comfortable focusing on their core values. For others, it may feel centering and life-giving to connect with a deeper part of ourselves in this way. If a survivor is interested in this kind of affirming self-exploration, here's a way that we can affirm them and we can support them. So the values card sort is an easy way to encourage self-discovery and connection with our core values. And it actually ends up being usually pretty fun and can build community within our program as well. So a value card sort activity, and I've put a link here for something that you could print out and cut out different cards. And the cards have value words on them as well as definitions of those values. And so there are a lot of ways to do this. A very simple way to do it is have folks kind of sort the cards into not an important value for me, a somewhat important value for me, and my most important core values. And have folks reflect on that, talk with one another, share. How does that value show up in your life? What are some things that you do to keep that value, to stay connected to that core value? And this can actually be really fun team building activity as well. And there are ways to take these kinds of activities and actually make them into art projects for people. So there's a lot of fun ways to engage this self-exploration. And through that self-exploration, people tend to connect with that why, right? That why of what about substance use is getting in the way of what matters most to them. And that once people figure out the why, people tend to figure out the how much more easily. And when things are really stalled is when sometimes we are focusing too much on the how to change substance use, or rather than focusing on the why would that be important for someone. That recovery is self-directed and empowering. And so it's not about anyone being persuaded or told how substance use isn't working for them or how they need to change, right? And here I have this quote from Jack Kerouac: "Not all those who wander are lost." And so sometimes as providers, we want it to be, we kind of want like instant results. For like, you have a substance use problem, I got you a treatment bed, go take care of the substance use problem, and then you'll come back and we'll deal with X, Y, Z, right? And that rarely is anybody's process of change that clear cut or simple. That everything takes time and is a process, and many times we're kind of fumbling our way through this. And it's not until we're kind of around the bend looking backwards that we can say, oh, those pieces fit together and this is what my journey looked like. While we're actually on the journey, it usually just feels kind of messy and confusing. And so understanding that kind of push and pull and that kind of back and forth of I want treatment, I don't want treatment, or my substance use isn't a problem, or I don't use substances, right? That like all of that is actually just part of the process, and that we're here many times to come alongside and bear witness to someone's process and support them, because there will be those openings, and the more that we are a supportive ally to somebody, the more likely they are to come to us when they're at a point where they feel like, okay, something's got to change and I'm not sure how to go about it. And so I'm a big fan of poetry. I think that poetry is something that we can use a lot in our programs, because when we've been through so much, poetry can contain the paradoxes of joy and heartbreak and horror and love and connectedness in ways that we can't always express and speak. And so I'm a big fan of using poetry as well as music. And we're not able to play this video, but I wanted to offer this link and this video to a poem to get rid of fear by Joy Harjo, our current U.S. Poet Laureate. And this can be a resource in supporting survivors to connect with an internal sense of resilience and empowerment. And while we may not always be in a place to give words to our own experience, many times we can together listen to music or to poetry and then talk about our reaction to that poem or to that piece of music. And that can help us access some of the healing pieces without necessarily needing to completely disclose or talk about maybe what we can't quite put words to yet. that recovery emerges from hope and gratitude. So recovery does not emerge from shame. Recovery does not emerge from, being told to be accountable, right? It emerges from a sense of connection, from a sense of hope, and from a sense of gratitude. And so some ways that we can nurture hope. One thing is the hero's journey. And so the hero's journey is something that has been found in different myths around the world. And in its most basic form, we can understand it that the hero takes a journey, comes across a point where everything seems lost, and then the hero has a victory. The hero is able to move forward. And that when we can help folks connect with their own hero's journey, that they can start seeing that this is part of my story, that this doesn't have to be the end of my story. And so here, offering the quote from Malala Yousafzai, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, I don't want to be remembered as the girl who was shot. I want to be remembered as the girl who stood up. And so here again, offering another poem. And if you ever want to connect with me offline about poetry or music, please reach out. Still I Rise by Dr. Maya Angelou. And this is something that when we would have recovery celebrations in honor of Recovery Month, which is September, we would very often print this out and as a whole group just recite this out loud, and how powerful it was to join our voices together and saying this poem together. It can really help us connect with our internal sense of hope. That recovery is holistic, that it is a mind, body, spirit experience. It exists on a continuum of health and wellness, and involves the process of healing and redefinition for ourselves and for our family. And that especially for women, what has been found is that this redefining self and identity work piece is especially important in healing from the problems of substance use as well as the effects of trauma. And that's something I want to invite everyone to do. Reflect on, how would someone have described you when you were 10 years old? And then type in the chat 3 words that describe you today that are not a relationship or a role. We're often defined as our relationship to others or a role that we have, but that actually doesn't tell us much about who we are. And so if you don't type in all 3, that's fine. You can type in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But go ahead and type in the chat box a word or more that's not a relationship and not a role that describes you today. Interested in people, smart, caring, peaceful, resilient, appreciative, brave, compassionate, dedicated, honest, funny, powerful, determined, resourceful, resilient, selfless, honest, brave, curious, empathetic. Y'all are lovely people. I want to be all your friends. Thanks, everyone. So this is an activity that actually comes from Helping Women Recover by Stephanie Covington, which is evidence-based in treating substance use and trauma in an integrated fashion, and can actually be, you don't have to be a formal treatment provider in order to use this group curriculum. So it's something that you might consider adding with it as a resource within your services. And then I wanted to offer up this activity too that people may enjoy doing in their program. So I call this masks. And first, what you do is you go online and you print out a bunch of different masks. And you have an array of masks, one mask per page. And you can have things from different cultures, different animals, or things from nature. I like to use the drama mask sometimes, superheroes, whatever would be relevant for people in your program. And then have people pick out whatever mask they would like and provide them with materials to write on and decorate the mask. So it can be markers, colored pencils, things like that. And ask people to decorate the mask using words, symbols, drawings, or however they want to decorate it. And the front side of the mask should represent the personal qualities that they want others to see in them, how they want to be known and recognized. On the back side, they can include things about themselves that they don't want to be known as, that don't characterize who they are. Give people some time to do this. You can play music in the background or just kind of have chit-chat while this is happening. After folks have had a chance to decorate their masks, ask them to consider what might be some connections between the front side and the back side. Are there any similarities? Are there any total opposites? What do they make out of having those two sides? And then open up the floor, invite people to share anything that they feel comfortable sharing with the group, and you can help weave together a conversation from there. One way to wrap up this activity is to then facilitate a conversation around what we can do to support ourselves and each other to be more aligned with that front side of that mask while overcoming some of the experiences on the back side. So recovery principle that we address discrimination and transcend shame and stigma. And there's a lot of ways that shame and stigma show up in our services because shame and stigma related to substance use is pervasive in our society. So of course our services are not free of shame and stigma. And so this takes a lot of reflection on our part, team discussions, and really rooting out where those messages of shame and stigma get delivered within our policies, our practices, our services, and really uprooting them and neutralizing them. And part of it can be reflecting on which of our policies and practices get in the way of being able to have real discussions about substance use. How do we overcome the decades of expectation of shame and stigma and being locked out of services, environments, situations, and relationships because of the stigma associated with substance use? And then how do we build safety for people to be able to discuss their experiences of substance use with us? Approaching substance use in a matter-of-fact manner, right? Being non-judgmental means that we're not here to talk about whether it's good or bad, right? It's just, it is what it is, and how can we help? How can we support? Suspending judgment and making it clear in our policies and practices that substance use alone won't result in someone being exited. And then the final principle of a recovery-oriented system of care is that recovery is a reality. It can and does happen. So now I'd love to hear from you in the chat box about which ones of these principles feel really aligned with your services and your approach, and which of these principles might feel kind of like they're new, or they might not be as aligned or might not fit as well. Feel free to go ahead and enter that into the chat while I talk about Recovery Capital. So Recovery Capital is the collection of internal and external supports a person can access that aid in the journey of recovery. There's a physical component, community, human, and social. And so these are the four major buckets of Recovery Capital. And our services tend to already support a lot of these areas, if not all four, for people. And so something to consider is what are we already doing to support recovery capital in each of these areas? And what can we easily, really with no or very little cost, add in order to shore up the resources around recovery? And you'll note that here, there's nothing around shame, there's nothing around denying people services because they continue to use. So physical recovery capital, our physical health, access to safe shelter and addressing our basic needs, financial resources, and medical and behavioral health care. And feel free to write in the chat box any kinds of services or things you do that support each of these buckets. And so something I wanted to share with y'all is the role of housing and voluntary services in supporting recovery. So looking at 2-year outcomes, it was found that people in housing programs that didn't require abstinence from substances and didn't require participation in services, that people were more likely to engage in substance use disorder treatment and did not use more substances compared to those housing programs that required abstinence from substances. And I wanted to highlight this because I think a lot of the time we're concerned that things will become a free-for-all in our programs if we don't require abstinence from substances, but actually quite the opposite has been found. Evidence has also shown that people who want to engage in substance use disorder treatment need to have stable housing, right? That we cannot really engage in formal treatment if we don't have access to safe and stable housing. And that people who did not access any treatment still had positive outcomes related to their substance use through just having access to safe and stable housing. So people were more likely to remain stably housed and stop using opioids and stimulants, so things like heroin, things like cocaine and methamphetamine, when programs used a person-centered and non-judgmental approach, individualized services to a person's self-identified needs and goals, and did not require enrollment in substance use disorder treatment, when programs made services available that provide information and resources on minimizing the adverse consequences of substance use. So sometimes when we talk about things like safer use, people might think, oh, well, this is giving people permission to use, or this is somehow saying that substance use is okay. And again, coming back to, we take a matter-of-fact approach because we're not here to tell someone whether their use is okay or not. This is actually a decision that they need to come to themselves, and they're much more likely to come to themselves when they see that, when they don't feel that we're trying to pressure them about their use. And that when programs actively engaged people and fostered open communication about substance use, that people were much more likely to remain stably housed and stop using. There is also 3-month data in a DV shelter found reductions in use of alcohol and stimulants using these very same results. So someone might not stop using right away, they might stop using a little bit later on, but even just with 3 months, they're already finding reductions in use in a DV shelter through using these approaches. The human aspect. So all of our skills, our education, our sense of self-efficacy, that if I set a goal, I can make it happen. And that many times the way that we build our self-efficacy is by having lots of mini goals and taking steps. And as we accomplish those steps, then we are able to then kind of build momentum for those, to tackle those larger life goals. A sense of hopefulness and then connection with our personal values. The social piece, having connections with family, having safe, intimate relationships of kinship, and social support. And we know that chaotic substance use, as well as experiences of trauma and victimization and abuse, can wreak havoc on our social connections. That we can end up really, really isolated from safe relationships because of abuse and trauma and victimization, and as well as the stigma and shame of substance use. And so this may be an area that's especially important to focus on and foster within our services to help people build up their recovery capital. And then finally, the community, that the community is one that is characterized by anti-stigma, that there are recovery role models, that there are people in long-term recovery openly in long-term recovery that we can look to and say, you know, and can hear that they've been here and that they found their path of recovery. And also that there are mutual aid groups available. And especially for folks within our programs who may, if they're not able to safely access mutual aid groups in their community, then seeing how we can build some of that, both that access both virtually as well as hosting on site. And the final piece, recovery community organizations. So what are recovery community organizations? They're nonprofit organizations that provide peer-based support services, including recovery support services, public education, and advocacy around policies. Their mission is generally to mobilize resources within and outside of the recovery community to increase the prevalence and quality of long-term recovery. And here, talking specifically about recovery from substance use and problematic and risky and concerns related to substance use, and that recovery community organizations do not provide formal treatment or formal clinical services. What they seek to do is contribute to fostering communities of recovery, so that community quadrant of recovery capital. And that people with lived experience of substance use disorders and recovery are helping others seeking recovery as well as family members. And so connecting with RCOs, the Association of Recovery Community Organizations is part of the Faces and Voices of Recovery, and I've offered that website here, as well as a current map of all of the ARCO-affiliated recovery community organizations in the U.S., including here we see one in Guam, and wanted to point out one in Juneau, Alaska. And these can be started. So on ARCO's website at the Faces and Voices of Recovery, there's actually a whole toolkit around how to start a recovery community organization with sample bylaws and all kinds of things, all kinds of resources. And so if there is not one currently available in your community, but you are connected or are able to connect with people in long-term recovery who are interested in forming a recovery community organization, there are a lot of resources here on how to start. And there are so many opportunities for collaboration with RCOs. There's a huge need for cross-training. So for us to share our knowledge around domestic violence and sexual assault and safety needs, for us to gather information and knowledge around recovery needs and how to support recovery and really use a recovery-oriented approach, what available resources there are, as well as what services and supports we can offer. There's opportunities for consultation, for linkages, both formal linkages and written kind of memorandums of understanding, as well as actively linking people who may be in one set of services but could benefit from another, so those warm handoffs, those warm referrals, and then co-facilitation and service exchange. So co-facilitation, there are people who have, I just love this model when people can do it. So people may decide where an advocate and then a recovery support specialist may co-facilitate a support group at either site where people who are experiencing both substance use and domestic violence or have experienced sexual assault can attend the support group and just get information in a way that is integrated and facilitated, rather than feeling like I have to go to these people for this and these people for that, and that nobody really gets the whole me. And then exchanging support services so that the RCO staff can facilitate a support group at the DVSA program, and DVSA staff can facilitate a support group at RCOs. So swapping services to expand access for survivors on both sides. So what can we do? Here are some different next steps. Reflect on current services and how they support each area of recovery capital. How could your program deepen support in each of these areas with little cost and little effort? I'm sure there are a lot of different things that you could come up with. Learning about the diversity of mutual aid groups available in your community as well as virtually. Supporting survivors' access to mutual aid through helping them anticipate and plan for any safety concerns, as well as helping to adapt mutual aid approaches to be more trauma-informed and responsive to their needs. And connecting with a local recovery community organization, exploring potential collaborations, including cross-training on DVSA needs and recovery needs. And as we mentioned, September is National Recovery Month. SAMHSA offers an online toolkit for planning your own recovery event. And recovery events can be really fun. They can celebrate experiences of recovery. They can celebrate efforts of recovery. I think it's really important in our recovery events not just to include people who may be in long-term recovery, but also include people who may be continuing to use in ways that don't align with their goals, but they're trying to figure it out, right? They're taking steps. They're on that path. And so they have a whole toolkit that there are a lot of different events, from raising awareness to just celebrations. And then before we turn to question and answer, wanted to provide some information. Our next webinar in this series, October 16th, we will have a webinar on the Combined Information Memorandum on supporting survivors of domestic violence who experience substance use and mental health concerns. It is a combined information memo with SAMHSA and ACS, and that will include research, resources, and state-level recommendations. And then on November 18th, we will actually have a webinar based on a guide that is forthcoming, a guide on supporting survivors who are currently using substances. And the first webinar based on that guide will be November 18th, Understanding Substances and Substance Use, including addressing common myths and misconceptions. And please sign up for our newsletter so you can stay up to date on all of our offerings. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today, and then offer a few more resources before we open it up for Q&A. We have our Tools for Transformation, Becoming Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed Organizations. These are all on our website. We have our toolkit, Coercion Related to Mental Health and Substance Use in the Context of Intimate Partner Violence. And then the relationship between intimate partner violence and substance use, an applied research paper. We also have an archived webinar on mutual aid from September 18th. So I spent a very, very small amount of time on mutual aid today. If you want to really take a deep dive and get a much better understanding of the different mutual aid resources, you can watch a recorded webinar at this website. Here's my contact information as well as our social media. Please feel free to follow us and to reach out. And then now, we would love to take any questions that folks may have. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in our Q&A box as well as our chat. We'll look for them in both places. Okay, so for DV survivors, do you all recommend safety planning around participating in AA? There was a recent ProPublica article outlining predators who have been mandated in 12-step programs and then victimizing vulnerable members. Thank you so much for your question. So this is a very common concern. A lot of individuals who have experienced abuse and victimization, and particularly women, experience going to different mutual aid meetings and then being hit on, being sexually harassed, and potentially even being victimized. And so while we would never say, at the same time, there are a lot of people who get a lot of benefit from AA and other mutual aid resources. I would remain neutral on whether or not someone should ever participate in AA or another group, but I would certainly offer information about what's available and then absolutely help people safety plan. And one of those things for someone who identifies as a woman may include finding women-specific groups. A lot of times women feel a lot more comfortable in women-specific groups, and that may be a way that that may be part of a woman's safety planning. And I've also found that a lot of women, when they first go to an AA group, have come back and told me that the women in the group kind of came up to them and welcomed them and let them know about other groups that had more women participants. Then there's also Women for Sobriety, which is takes a very trauma-informed approach and is gender-specific. Absolutely, there can be especially in the case of substance use coercion, or when people may have an abuser who has also been using, just running into a past partner at a mutual aid group can be a big concern. And so for some survivors, they've chosen to go to mutual aid groups that are kind of out of the way, not in their direct community, in a hope of not running into anyone that may have been an ex-partner as well. So an app for recovery that has been FDA approved. Yes, it's called Reset, R-E-S-E-T, and it's by Paratherapeutics. Oh, and someone wrote in the chat, search for closed meetings. That can also be helpful. Closed meetings are still going to welcome anybody who identifies as a member of that tradition. And something that I have found really helpful, switching back to talk about mutual aid again, something I found really helpful is actually going to a group, to an open meeting of the group, before giving someone a referral for a group, or offering to attend with them so we can get a sense of it together and I have a sense of what the group is when I'm, referring someone to it. Yeah, that's right. Closed meetings don't protect from people who may potentially victimize someone. Yeah, because you just need to be a member of AA. Mm-hmm. Great. More questions coming in. Oh, thank you so much, Tiffany, for posting the web link for the app. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carla, who can provide information on evaluation and kind of next steps for our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for everything you do for people who are survivors. Thank you.
And with that, we have run out of time. Thank you, Gabriella, for today's webinar, and thank you to Carla for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the Center. Within the next week, we'll be sending you a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of the afternoon.